Now, the King and Queen have begun their landmark tour of Australia by joining a church congregation for Sunday service. There was a small protest, but royal fans so far outnumber the people moaning. The King and Queen arrived in Sydney on Friday for their 6-day visit to the Commonwealth nation to celebrate its people, culture and heritage. Royal reporter Cameron Walker has all the latest from Sydney for us.
Welcome home, Your Majesties, just, I think, sums up the mood here in northern Sydney this morning. The King and Queen attended a church service at St Thomas's Church in northern Sydney, meeting the local congregation, but also, of course, meeting the crowds. Over 1,000 people estimated to have been here, braving the heat. Of course, it's summer here in Australia, in order to try and catch a glimpse or even meet their Majesties, the King and Queen, and several were lucky enough to do so. It's clearly a very packed schedule. The King will be off to the New South Wales Parliament, where he'll be attending a reception celebrating the bicentenary of the Legislative Council here in New South Wales. He also has 2 private audiences with the Governor-General of Australia and the Governor of New South Wales, Margaret Beazley, as well. I spoke to some members of the crowd, and here is what they said.
We're very excited for the King and Queen to come.
Very excited.
Let's go.
We basically missed our own service to come and get a glimpse of him, so yeah, it's very exciting.
Seen him as Prince before, first time as King.
I remember him as a young boy at school in Victoria.
I was around when his mother made the first trip to Australia in 1954. I was a little girl at school.
He's done pretty well at age 75 to come all this way.
They represent so much good in the world.
I'm a big supporter of the royal. I'm born in Nepal, live in Australia.
Now, the noise from the crowd was electric when the King and Queen were doing their walkabout, and it certainly drowned out the noise of a small number of protesters which were also here outside the church to, let's say, greet their Majesties. I'm not sure they would see it that way.
I want to say to King Charles, give my land back. This land was colonised. This land was taken by force, of brutality, through massacres of First Nations people.
Always was, always will be!
The King is clearly very mindful of the fact that he's been diagnosed with cancer, and his schedule has been designed in such a way to allow him time to rest. That's why there was no engagements carried out yesterday. The engagements kind of stop mid-afternoon today, and then tomorrow he'll be flying on to Canberra with Her Majesty the Queen for several other engagements.
Brilliant. Well, it looks lovely down there. Cameron, I think, is doing a cracking job. And there is only a small protest, Nigel. We were warned that there might be sort of like, you know, we were led to believe that everybody hates the royals and they shouldn't be there and give us Australia back. And we're not seeing too much of that, are we?
No, we're not. And I mean, even the Prime Minister there, Anthony Albanese, he's a Republican. He would eventually like to get rid of the royals, but he sort of parked it into the long grass. I think that the last referendum on this was 1999, when Australians voted 55% to keep the monarch as head of state. And it does bring stability to them. Why upset it? It's a bit like what we're doing over here with the House of Lords. The biggest danger about reform is you destabilise the constitution. The same thing applies in Australia. And I gather down there at the moment, the biggest protests are actually by a British group, Republic, who've gone down there to protest at the King being there in the first place.
I mean, you sort of got to slightly admire that. They fancied a little bit of a trip to
Well, I was going to say, let's hope they're not green campaigners at the same time.
Yeah, and most people, when you look at the reports, are really, really happy to see the King and Queen, and it's so nice to see the King out there actually looking well, considering that he had his own health scare not all that long ago, to get on a flight, go down under, go see people, do his job, which is essentially what it is, but he just looks happy. And I think the majority of people are supportive. The kids there, that was really interesting. You sort of look at the children because they're growing up with that around them and they seem very happy to be out there waving flags. And I think it is fantastic. You will always get those who disagree. and that's their right to disagree. But to stand there and shout from the sidelines, well, what is their proposal? So, give us our country back. Well, again, but where's it gone? Who's taking it?
Does it really make that much of a difference, Nigel?
No, it doesn't.
It's just a title thing, is it?
Well, it's a little bit more than that. I mean, you still have... the issue is whether or not Australia should have its own head of state, rather than having the king who is 12,000 miles away. And you've got a Governor-General there who there's a little bit of a resentment to that. But all that seems to be passing slightly on that basic point. Does it really make a huge amount of difference to day-to-day life if we change things? And what it could do is destabilise the system that they have at the moment.
And obviously we've got the Caribbean islands meeting coming up soon, where it's a different kettle of fish again, where you think it might be more antagonistic.
I don't know if it will. I think that we've kind of peaked on that. Everybody knows that there's a conversation about slavery reparations. People will fall on either side of that, and I personally don't think we need to be paying them back. And it is quite interesting that some of the Caribbean islands wanted to be independent, and that's their right, but it is done on the will of those individuals. I don't see that we have to get upset every time the head of state goes over to a Commonwealth country. And there was a poll out recently which is quite interesting to say that the most support for the Commonwealth came from those countries, and it was actually Great Britain who had the worst impression of Britain in the Commonwealth. So when you went over to other countries, they were actually quite happy and quite content. There are those that have got their independence, and that's fantastic, and it was a matter for them.
Why do we hate this country so much at the moment, Nigel? I mean, it's mad. Other people have a much higher opinion of us.
Yeah, I think basically, Claire's absolutely right there.
Will you stop agreeing with your wife, you know?
I know.
I'm sure
going to get you
as the afternoon goes on, we won't be.
You're still in the stable tonight, you know that.
I've got my hay waiting for me. That is, obviously, it's a matter for each country to decide whether they want to be independent, whether they want to be a republic, or they gain benefits out of having a king. So they make that decision. And the next stage is that the king will face head-on these slavery reparations because he moves on to Samoa and the Commonwealth Heads of Government Conference there. After this, I mean, it's a punishing schedule. He's got 11 days on the road, basically. So he will actually confront that. And certainly the slavery debate then will be quite interesting. We're not going to pay reparations. It's not going to happen. But certainly there'll be demands for it.
Using the internet without a VPN is a bit like taking to the road without car insurance. All it takes is one unlucky moment to cost you a lot of cash. We want to help protect you. This video's sponsor, Private Internet Access, is the VPN to help keep you safe. Now, you might be asking, what is a VPN? Well, a virtual private network is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel. This way, it shields your digital life from the eyes of those that are looking to exploit your private information. Whenever you connect to the internet on a public Wi-Fi network, such as at airports, coffee shops, friends' houses, or even in your own home, your data is at risk of being stolen. Hackers that are connected to the same Wi-Fi network have the ability to steal your personal data with ease. T-Mobile reached a settlement this year with the US Federal Communications Commission after they suffered data breaches in 2021, 22, and 23. In 2023 alone, over 37 million customers' data was exposed. And it's not just hackers to be concerned about. Information can be censored. When Canada passed their C-18 bill, social media giants decided to ban news content on their platforms. But PIA can protect your ability to consume the news content that you love. Private Internet Access is available for all platforms: Windows, macOS, Android, Linux, iOS, and you can use one Private Internet Access subscription to protect an unlimited number of devices at the same time. Plus, we've got a huge GB News discount. Click the link in this video's description and you'll get 83% off PIA. That is under £2 a month, and you'll get an extra 4 months completely free. There's also a 30-day money-back guarantee. So head to piavpn.com/GB News. to start protecting yourself digitally today.
But first, I'm joined now by the former Australian High Commissioner to the UK and the former Australian Attorney General, George Brandis. George, thank you for joining GB News this morning. It's the evening where you are, I'm sure, in Australia. How is the visit of the King and Queen being received by Australians?
Well, it's been very successful so far. I mean, today has been the first day of engagements by the King and Queen. As you heard on the news bulletin, they attended a church service this morning, and then the King went to the New South Wales Parliament for an extremely important observance, the 200th anniversary of the creation of the New South Wales Legislative Council, which is the first parliamentary chamber in Australia in colonial times. So this marks the 200th anniversary of parliamentary government in Australia, and the King presided at that ceremony. He had attended a lunch, and then this afternoon he's had a number of engagements with dignitaries. But look, the crowds both outside the church and outside the New South Wales Parliament House were very enthusiastic, very large crowds, and I'm sure His Majesty is delighted with the reception he's received.
And George, is it right then that the large crowds greeting them, you're seeing on the screen now images from the visit today, earlier today, is it right that that reflects the wider approval of the monarchy? Or, of course, we hear reports in the UK of Republicans. I think the King has said, I'll be the King of your country as long as you want me to be, which is, I guess, all he can say. But how big a problem for the monarchy is the Republican movement?
Well, the first point to make, Christopher, is, of course, that King Charles visits Australia as King of Australia, not as King of England. He is your king, but he's our king as well. And Australians know that. And most Australians are very happy about that. There has been a Republican movement in Australia stretching back to the 1970s, or even a little earlier than that. And about perhaps 25 years ago, when we had a referendum on the subject, it was fairly strong. But I have to say that I've never seen support for the idea of an Australian republic so feeble in my adult lifetime as it is at the moment. There was an opinion poll published about a fortnight ago which showed support for Australia becoming a republic at 33%, support for the status quo at 45%, and the rest undecided. Now, I don't remember a time since these polls first began to be taken in the late 1970s, when support for a republic was as low as 33%. Usually it sits somewhere in the mid-40s. And I think that reflects the fact that the issue, Australians are sick of this issue. We've heard too much about it for so long, and we've really moved on. It's very much, I think, yesterday's issue.
But we see reports in the UK of 5 of the 6 state premiers, in quotes, snubbing the King, not wanting to meet up. And that's interpreted over here as a kind of antipathy or a kind of shrugging the shoulders towards the monarchy. Is that incorrect?
I wouldn't overinterpret it. I mean, these are all but one of them are Labor premiers. The Labor Party is in government in all but one of the states at the moment. And the Labor Party is almost uniformly pro-Republican, and in that respect it doesn't reflect the plurality of opinion in the country at large. The Premier in my state, Queensland, is 6 days away from a state election, so one can perhaps understand why he's rather preoccupied. As for the others, I think it's poor form, but as I say, the Labor Party is a lonely redoubt of republicanism in this country.
It's appropriate then for the modern Australia that there's not an Australian person as head of state. That seems to sit well still with the country.
Well, I think that in a sense misses the point, because we feel that we know King Charles very well. He went to school here when he was a teenager, something that obviously meant a great deal to him, and he often reflects on as a very happy time of his life as a youngster. This is his 17th visit. Australians are so familiar with him. They like him. They regard him as ours. And of course he's an Englishman and he lives mostly in England. But Australians have a sense that he is ours as well, that although not an Australian himself, that he is one of us. And I'm sure that is grounded in the fact that he displays such obvious and enthusiastic affection for Australia and its people.
The King and Queen, of course, George Brandis, head to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Samoa from Australia. Why did the state of Victoria withdraw support for the 2026 Commonwealth Games last year? That's also seen as a kind of, again, an issue with Australia and the monarchy. Is that the wrong way to read it?
That is the wrong way to read it. I mean, that was a catastrophic decision by a disgraceful Labor state government led by a premier who's no longer in office. It was an embarrassment to Australia. It was a shocking thing to do, but I wouldn't interpret it as other than a particularly poor decision by a very left-wing government which just wasn't interested in this major sporting event. I wouldn't interpret it necessarily as an anti-monarchical decision.
And just finally, George Brandis, how should we judge the success of this visit? I mean, the crowd's turning out looks great. It's obviously the weather's much better than in the UK. It looks fantastic images from down under. How should we judge the success for ours and your King and Queen?
Well, I think the most practical way to judge is to look at the crowds, and I'm sure particularly when their majesties take their walk around the Sydney Opera House, as they will do later in the program, for instance, or when they go to the Australian War Memorial tomorrow, you'll see very enthusiastic crowds because, as I said, there is deep and abiding affection in Australia for King Charles. There is, people are well aware of how much this country means to him, and that affection is reciprocated.